They said I ran away, but the general stopped the ceremony to recognize me as colonel. Major Richard Thompson felt the world crumbling around him as hundreds of eyes judged him during the ceremony, honoring the heroes of the floods that devastated Lakewood. His wife Karen had fainted minutes before. His daughter Emily wept uncontrollably in her grandmother's arms, and he had just been publicly accused of desertion. It was when Colonel Michael Reynolds approached the microphone that everything began. Richard's legs trembled as he heard his name called, not to receive an honor, but to be humiliated before his entire family and fellow officers. "Major Richard Thompson," Colonel Reynolds said firmly, "you are accused of abandoning your post during the March flood rescue operations. We have documents proving your absence at the critical moment of the mission." The silence in the military base auditorium was deafening. Richard felt his blood run cold. How was this possible? He had saved dozens of people that terrible night. He had risked his life entering houses on the verge of collapse. "This isn't true," Richard tried to defend himself, but his voice cracked. "Sir, the time for explanations has passed," Colonel Reynolds interrupted, extending a folder of documents. "These reports clearly show you left your unit at 10 p.m. and only returned in the early hours." Karen, who had just been treated by paramedics, staggered to her feet upon hearing the words. Her eyes were red, not just from tears, but from the spike in her blood pressure from the shock. "Richard, tell me this isn't true," she whispered, clutching her husband's arm. Margaret, Karen's mother, and a respected figure in Lakewood's military community, stared at Richard with a mix of disappointment and anger. She had always harbored doubts about her son-in-law, believing her daughter deserved better. "I always knew," Margaret murmured loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I always knew this man wasn't worthy of my daughter." Emily, just 16, looked at her father with tear-filled eyes. She couldn't understand how the man who had always been her hero could now be accused of cowardice. Colonel Reynolds continued his presentation, displaying timestamps and reports that seemed irrefutable. Richard struggled to recall every moment of that terrible night, but his mind was clouded by the public humiliation. "Your insignia, Major," the colonel ordered, holding out his hand. With trembling hands, Richard removed the major's insignia from his uniform. 20 years of military service seemed to collapse in that moment. The sound of the insignia hitting the floor echoed through the auditorium like a judge's gavel. Karen clutched her chest, her heart racing. The stress of the situation was taking a dangerous toll on her health. She had always had minor heart issues, but she never imagined facing something like this. In the days that followed, the Thompson family became the center of gossip in Lakewood. Richard tried to maintain his dignity, but he saw neighbors cross the street to avoid greeting him. Karen's colleagues at the municipal hospital began treating her coldly. Emily suffered the consequences at school. Classmates who once respected her now whispered behind her back. During recess, a group of girls approached her with malice. "Hey, Emily," said Ashley, a jealous classmate. "Is it true your dad's a coward? Everyone's saying he ran when people needed him most." "That's not true," Emily replied firmly, though tears welled in her eyes. "My mom said she'll never trust your family again," another girl added. "What kind of family do you even have?" Richard spent his days trying to piece together the events of that night. He clearly remembered saving the Miller family, who were trapped in a house being swept away by the current. He remembered carrying old Walter on his back for nearly a kilometer to the relief point. He searched for Sergeant Brian Wilson, who had been with him for much of the operation. Brian was a simple man, a father of 3, who had always shown loyalty to his superiors. "Brian, do you remember that night?" Richard asked when he finally found him alone in the mess hall. "You were with me when we saved the Miller family, weren't you?" Brian looked away, nervously stirring his coffee. "I'm sorry, Major. Mr. Richard, I can't talk about that." "What do you mean you can't? You saw what happened. You helped me carry the children." "Look, I have a family to support," Brian whispered, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Colonel Reynolds made it very clear that anyone who testifies in your favor could have career problems." Richard felt the ground vanish beneath his feet. If even Brian, who had always been loyal, was afraid to speak the truth, then the situation was worse than he'd imagined. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us, who are just starting out. Now back to the story. At home, Karen tried to hide her worry, but Richard noticed how she clutched her chest whenever she thought no one was looking. Her heart medication had increased, and she had visibly lost weight in just a few weeks. "Karen, I'll prove my innocence," Richard said one night, holding his wife's hands. "I don't know how, but I will." "Richard, I believe you," Karen replied, but her voice trembled. "I just don't know if my heart can take much more of this." Mrs. Margaret, who lived 2 blocks away, made a point of walking past their house every day, always with a disapproving look. She had spread word around the neighborhood that she'd always known Richard was no good. "I warned my daughter," she told anyone who would listen. "That man always seemed shady to me." Now the truth has come out. Richard decided to investigate the documents filed against him. He obtained a copy through a lawyer friend and spent hours analyzing every detail. That's when he began noticing small inconsistencies. The report claimed he had left his post at 10 p.m., but Richard clearly remembered speaking with Captain Smith at 10:15, still at the base. How could he have abandoned his post and still been talking to his superior 15 minutes later? Another detail that puzzled him was the signature on the departure report. It looked like his, but something was off about the way the R was written. Richard always added a small loop to the letter, but in the document's signature, there was no loop at all. Emily, seeing her parents suffering, decided to take action. She created a fake social media profile and began searching for anything related to the March flood. She spent hours scrolling through Lakewood residents' groups, looking for photos or videos from that night. And then she found it. In a Facebook group called Lakewood United, there was a video posted by a local resident. The video clearly showed her father carrying an elderly woman in his arms, crossing a flooded street. The date and time were stamped in the corner of the screen, March 15th, 11:47 p.m. "Dad, Dad!" Emily shouted, running to show him her discovery. "Look at this. You're right here saving Mrs. Eleanor at 11:47. How could you have fled at 10 p.m. if you were here an hour and 47 minutes later saving people?" Richard looked at the video with tears in his eyes. It was the proof he needed. Immediately, he tried to contact the person who had posted the video, but discovered the profile had been deactivated. When he tried to access the video again the next day, it had disappeared. "This can't be," Richard murmured, refreshing the page repeatedly. "It was here yesterday." Emily also noticed her account had been temporarily suspended for suspicious activity. Someone had reported her searches as spam. The feeling of being targeted was becoming real. Karen, watching the family's despair, decided to seek medical help. Her heart problems were worsening, and she was experiencing constant chest pain. During the appointment, the cardiologist was blunt. "Mrs. Karen, your blood pressure is dangerously high, and the tests show concerning changes in your EKG. This stress is literally attacking your heart." "Doctor, I can't abandon my family right now," Karen replied, fighting back tears. "If you don't take care of your health, you may not have a family left to support." The doctor answered gently but firmly. "I need to increase your medication, and you'll need closer monitoring." Richard began to suspect there was something bigger behind his humiliation. He and Colonel Reynolds had competed for the same promotion 2 years earlier. Richard had been chosen to lead an important operation at the border, a role Reynolds had also wanted. Even more intriguing was the fact that Reynolds had received a special commendation for his actions during the flood. According to official reports, he had coordinated the rescue of several families. But Richard distinctly remembered not seeing Reynolds in the field that night. He decided to discreetly seek out other soldiers who had been part of the operation. Most refused to talk, but a young soldier named Anthony Parker agreed to speak privately. "Mr. Richard," Anthony said nervously, "I saw you that night. You saved my cousin and her children. They were trapped on the second floor of a house about to collapse." "Do you remember what time that was?" Richard asked eagerly. "Of course I remember. It was just after midnight because I checked my phone when you carried the kids out. My cousin was screaming that she couldn't get down, and you went up to get her." Richard felt a mix of relief and anger. There were people who knew the truth, but fear was keeping them silent. He began to realize he was dealing with something much bigger than an unfair accusation. That same week, Richard received an unexpected call. It was from an elderly man who introduced himself as Howard Gardner, a retired veteran living in Lakewood. "Major Richard, I need to speak with you." The man's voice trembled. "It's about the night of the flood. I was there and I know what really happened." They met in a square in the center of town. Howard was a 72-year-old man who had served in the military for decades. Despite his age, his posture still carried military dignity. "Major, I was trapped under a beam in my backyard when you found me," Howard began, his eyes moist. "I thought I'd be stuck there all night, or worse. You pulled me out with your own hands." "Do you remember what time that was?" Richard asked, his heart racing. "How could I forget? It was 2 in the morning. I know because when you took me to the school being used as a shelter, the nurse wrote down my arrival time. I still have the paper here." Howard pulled a yellowed piece of paper from his pocket. It was an improvised medical record handwritten by a volunteer. Howard Gardner, 72 years old, rescued by Major Richard at 2:15 a.m., minor abrasions, blood pressure elevated due to shock. "Why didn't you say this before?" Richard asked. "Because I was afraid, Major. A sergeant came to my house a few days later and said it would be better if I didn't get involved, that people like me had nothing to gain by testifying against superiors." Richard hugged the elderly Howard, finally feeling a glimmer of hope. But he knew he needed more evidence. One witness was important, but it wouldn't be enough against the word of a colonel and official documents. Karen, who had stabilized with new medication, decided to take drastic action. She knew the wife of the regional commanding general, Mrs. Deborah, through hospital charity events. During a social gathering at the base, Karen approached Mrs. Deborah with determination. "Mrs. Deborah, I need to talk to you about my husband, Major Richard." "Karen, dear, what a difficult situation," Mrs. Deborah replied with genuine sympathy. "But you know I can't involve myself in military matters. I only ask that you speak with the general. My husband is innocent, and there are people too afraid to tell the truth. Colonel Reynolds is preventing witnesses from coming forward." Mrs. Deborah grew thoughtful. She had always admired Karen for her dedication to hospital work and the dignified way she carried her family. "Let me see what I can do," she finally said. "Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. Meanwhile, Richard continued his personal investigation. He decided to visit the families he remembered helping that night. His first stop was the Miller family's home. He was certain he'd saved them. Mrs. Jennifer Miller answered the door, her eyes red from crying. "Major Richard, it's so awful what they're doing to you," she said, inviting him inside. "Mrs. Jennifer, I need your help. Do you remember that night?" "How could I forget? If it weren't for you, my husband, our 3 children and I would have lost our lives. The house was being swept away by the water, and you went inside to pull us out one by one. Do you remember any details that could prove I was there?" Mrs. Jennifer thought for a moment, then her eyes lit up. "Yes. My youngest, little Ethan, had a high fever. When you carried him to the shelter, the nurse took his temperature, 103 degrees. She said if we'd waited another hour, it could have been dangerous. Do you remember what time that was?" The nurse wrote everything down. "We arrived at the shelter at 2:30 a.m. I kept the paper because I wanted to thank you in person later." Another piece of proof that Richard had been saving lives in the early hours, long after he was accused of abandoning his post. He visited other families and all had similar stories with times that completely contradicted the official version. The Johnson family, who lost their home but were saved by Richard at 3 a.m. The elderly Smiths, rescued at 3:15. Each story was a fragment of the truth being buried. But Richard noticed something troubling. Every time he visited these families, soldiers would show up the next day to discourage them from speaking. Some began to fear giving testimony. "Major, we want to help," Mr. Smith said during one conversation. "But they came here saying if we got involved, we could have trouble with the city, with our benefits. We're simple folks, we can't take that risk." Richard understood their fear, but frustration gnawed at him. There was an organized scheme to silence anyone who could testify in his favor. Emily, however, didn't give up. She created new social media profiles and began reaching out directly to people who had posted about the flood. Many didn't respond, but some agreed to talk. A young woman named Megan, who was a journalism student, had done amateur coverage of the tragedy for a college project. She had hours of footage from that night. "Look, I have a lot of material," Megan said during a video call with Emily. "But after I posted some things, people started pressuring me to take them down. They said I was interfering with the official investigation." "Do you have any footage of my dad?" Emily asked anxiously. "I do. Your dad appears in several scenes rescuing people. I even filmed when he carried an elderly woman who had fainted. It was really moving. Can you send me those recordings?" "I can, but promise me you'll be careful. It seems like some very powerful people want to hide this stuff." Emily got the recordings and showed them to her parents. It was even more evidence of Richard's innocence, but they knew they had to be strategic about how to use this material. Karen suggested finding a lawyer specialized in military matters. Through a colleague at the hospital, they got a referral to Dr. Charles Bennett, who had experience with cases of military injustice. "Dr. Bennett, my husband is the victim of a setup," Karen explained during the consultation. The lawyer reviewed all the documents and evidence the family had gathered. "You have enough material to challenge the accusations," he finally said, "but taking on the military hierarchy isn't simple. We need a careful strategy." "What do you suggest?" Richard asked. "First, we'll organize all the evidence in an irrefutable way. Second, we'll try to identify the real motivations behind these accusations. Something tells me there are personal interests involved." Dr. Bennett began his own investigation into Colonel Reynolds. Through contacts in military legal circles, he uncovered interesting details about the colonel's career. Reynolds had been passed over for several promotions over the years due to conduct issues. There were reports of abuse of authority and favoritism. Most importantly, he was being considered for a major promotion that depended on his performance during the flood. "Richard, your Colonel Reynolds isn't just ambitious," Dr. Bennett explained. "He's desperate. This may have been his last chance to get a promotion before mandatory retirement. So he fabricated his own heroics and made me the scapegoat." "Exactly. And from what I've found, you're not his first victim. There are other suspicious cases throughout his career." Meanwhile, the regional commanding general, General Robert Anderson, was troubled by the inconsistencies Mrs. Deborah had mentioned. He decided to personally review the rescue operation reports. General Anderson was a man of integrity, with over 30 years of an impeccable career. He had risen to the highest rank on merit and didn't tolerate dishonesty in his ranks. As he analyzed the documents, he noticed several oddities. Reynolds' reports about his own involvement were excessively detailed and self-congratulatory, something rare in military records. There were also discrepancies in the timelines that didn't make sense. He discreetly summoned some officers who had participated in the operation and began asking specific questions. The answers he received didn't match the official version of events. When questioned privately, Captain Smith admitted his doubts. "General, I clearly remember speaking with Major Richard at 22:15 at the base. How could he have abandoned his post at 22 if he was talking to me 15 minutes later?" "Why didn't you mention this before?" the general asked. "Sir, Colonel Reynolds made it clear that questioning the case would be seen as insubordination." General Anderson began to realize there was a much bigger problem than a simple desertion accusation. There were signs of evidence tampering and witness intimidation. He discreetly ordered a covert investigation led by Major William Cooper, one of his most trusted officers who had no ties to any of those involved. Major Cooper began interviewing people who had been present during the rescue operation. He quickly discovered that the official version of events didn't match reality. Soldiers who had been instructed not to talk started opening up when they realized the investigation came directly from the general. The stories they told painted a completely different picture. "Major Cooper," said Private Parker, "I saw Major Richard saving people all night. He didn't stop for a single minute. He was always at the front, going into the most dangerous places." "And Colonel Reynolds?" Cooper asked. "The colonel spent most of the night at the base, coordinating over the radio. Not that that's wrong. Someone had to coordinate. But he wasn't in the field like he claimed in the reports." The investigation also revealed that several documents had been altered after the events. Richard's signatures on exit reports were clearly forged, and there was evidence that times had been changed. Even worse, Major Cooper discovered that Reynolds had threatened several subordinates to keep them from testifying in Richard's favor. There was a clear pattern of intimidation and manipulation. Richard, unaware of the covert investigation, continued fighting to clear his name. He decided to visit the hospital that had served as a support center during the flood, hoping to find medical records of the people he had saved. The head nurse, Mrs. Betty, a 60-year-old woman with 40 years of experience, welcomed him warmly. "Major Richard, what an injustice they're doing to you," she said, shaking her head. "I was on duty here that terrible night, and I saw you bringing in the injured all night long. Do you have any records of that?" "I certainly do. We noted everything. Who arrived, what time, who brought them in, their condition. It was a matter of organization. It was total chaos." Mrs. Betty brought out a folder with dozens of handwritten records. On several of them it read, "Brought in by Major Richard Thompson, with times ranging from 22:30 to 4:15 in the morning." "Major, you saved 43 people that night," Mrs. Betty said with admiration. 43 I counted because I was so impressed. Some people you brought in 2 or 3 times because you went back for their family members." Richard felt his eyes fill with tears. 43 lives. He had saved 43 lives on the night he was supposedly fleeing like a coward. "Can you provide copies of these records?" he asked. "Of course I can, and more. I'll speak to all the nurses who were here. They'll testify too." Mrs. Betty did more than she promised. She arranged a meeting between Richard and several people who had been treated at the hospital that night. One by one, they confirmed he had saved them. The most touching story was Mrs. Eleanor Sullivan's, an 80-year-old woman who had been rescued from her home as it was being swept away by the current. "My dear, if it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here today," she said, holding Richard's hands. "You carried me in your arms like I was a child. I was so scared, but you calmed me down, saying everything would be all right." "Do you remember what time it was?" "I remember it like it was yesterday. It was 3:15 in the morning. I know because I always check the clock when I can't sleep. And when you found me, I'd been awake for hours praying for someone to help me." Emily, who had accompanied her father to this meeting, cried with emotion as she heard all these stories. Her father wasn't just innocent, he was a true hero being punished unjustly. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. Margaret, who had witnessed this entire reunion at the hospital, finally began to realize she had made a terrible mistake. Seeing the testimonies of all those people, hearing the details of how Richard had risked his life to save others, she felt deep shame. That night she showed up at Karen and Richard's house. It was the first time she'd stepped foot there since the day of the accusation. "Richard," she said, her voice trembling, "I made a terrible mistake. I judged you without knowing the truth. I beg your forgiveness." Richard embraced his mother-in-law with generosity. "Margaret, you were deceived like everyone else. What matters is that we know the truth now." "I'll use all my influence to help," she promised. "I know many important people in town and they'll all learn what really happened." Margaret kept her word. She organized meetings with officers' wives, community leaders, and influential people in Lakewood. At each meeting, she told Richard's true story and asked for support to right the injustice. Social pressure began to grow. Respected families in the military community started openly questioning the accusations against Richard. Many officers' wives, led by Margaret, wrote a collective letter to the commanding general demanding a review of the case. Karen, strengthened by the support she received and with her health stabilized by new medication, decided to take a bolder step. During a social event at the base, she approached Colonel Reynolds directly. "Colonel Reynolds," she said firmly, "I want you to know that I know the truth about that night." Reynolds visibly stiffened. "Mrs. Thompson, I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I do, Colonel. I know my husband saved dozens of people while you were at the base, and I know you altered documents to frame him." People nearby began paying attention to the conversation. Reynolds tried to step away, but Karen continued, speaking loud enough for others to hear. "I have proof, Colonel. Medical records, witnesses, recordings. The truth always comes out." Reynolds' discomfort was noticed by several officers present. Whispers spread about Karen's courage in publicly confronting a superior. Meanwhile, General Anderson's secret investigation was reaching damning conclusions. Major Cooper had gathered irrefutable evidence that Reynolds had manipulated documents, intimidated witnesses, and falsified his own involvement in the rescue operation. Worse still, the investigation revealed Reynolds had used his position to claim credit for acts of heroism that weren't his. Many deeds attributed to him in official reports had actually been performed by Richard and other officers. General Anderson was outraged by the findings. In his 30-year career, he had rarely seen such a severe case of dishonesty and abuse of power. He called an urgent meeting with his closest advisors. "Gentlemen," he said in a solemn voice, "we are dealing with one of the most serious cases of military misconduct I have ever seen. An honorable officer was unjustly accused, while the true culprit manipulated evidence to cover up his own incompetence." "What will the procedure be, General?" his aide asked. "We will correct this injustice as publicly as possible, and we will make an example of whoever twisted the truth." The general ordered all records related to the rescue operation to be reviewed by an independent committee. He also directed that a new investigation be opened into all actions of Colonel Reynolds during his career. Meanwhile, Richard finally uncovered the information he had been searching for. Private Brian Wilson, who had initially refused to testify out of fear, sought Richard out at his home over the weekend. "Major, I can't take this anymore," Brian said with tears in his eyes. "I have to tell the truth." Brian revealed that Reynolds had blackmailed him, threatening to transfer him to a remote base far from his family if he testified in Richard's favor. More than that, Brian had recordings on his phone of conversations where Reynolds admitted to manipulating documents. "Why did you record these conversations?" Richard asked. "Because I thought it was strange how hard he pushed me to lie. I figured I might need to protect myself someday. I never imagined it would be to protect you." The recordings were clear. In Reynolds' voice, explicit instructions could be heard, telling Brian to change his testimony, along with confessions about altering times in official reports. Richard hugged Brian gratefully. "Brian, you're braver than you realize. I know this wasn't an easy decision. Major, you've always been fair with me. I couldn't let this injustice go on." With all the evidence gathered, Dr. Charles Bennett decided it was time to act formally. He prepared a complete dossier containing all the documents, recordings, testimonies, and medical records proving Richard's innocence. The dossier was submitted directly to the office of the Regional Commanding General. Dr. Bennett also sent copies to the High Command and the Army's internal oversight agencies. General Anderson received the dossier on the same day that Major Cooper submitted the final report of the confidential investigation. The conclusions of both documents were identical. Richard was completely innocent and had been the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by Reynolds. The general decided the case needed a public and definitive resolution. After all, Richard had been publicly humiliated, and his vindication should be just as public. He began planning how to right the wrong in a way that would ensure the entire military and civilian community knew the truth. The idea that emerged was bold but fitting for the gravity of the situation. The annual graduation ceremony for the Regional Military Academy was scheduled for the following week. It was the most important event on the local military calendar, with hundreds of graduates, families, and officials in attendance. General Anderson decided this would be the perfect moment for Richard's full rehabilitation. Meanwhile, Reynolds was beginning to realize his situation was deteriorating. Some subordinates had changed their attitude toward him, and rumors were circulating about an ongoing investigation. Desperate, he tried to expedite a transfer to another region, citing urgent family matters. But the request was denied by General Anderson himself, who was already aware of his attempts to flee. On the eve of the graduation, Reynolds made one last desperate move. He went to Richard's home trying to negotiate a deal. "Major, perhaps we can settle this amicably," Reynolds said, visibly nervous. "Settle what, Colonel?" Richard replied firmly. "Look, there may have been some misunderstandings in the reports. Perhaps we can find a way to reverse the accusations without too much fuss. Colonel, all I want is for the truth to come out. And it will." Reynolds left Richard's house, knowing there was no way out. His attempts to cover up the situation had failed, and now he would have to face the consequences of his actions. On graduation day, Richard was personally invited by General Anderson to attend the event. The invitation was mysterious, simply asking him to be present with his family and dressed in his formal uniform. Karen, Emily, and Margaret accompanied Richard to the event. They didn't know what to expect, but sensed something important was about to happen. The Academy auditorium was packed. Hundreds of family members, military personnel of all ranks, and civilian officials filled every available seat. The atmosphere was both solemn and celebratory. General Anderson began the ceremony with the usual protocols. The new officers were called one by one to receive their insignias and diplomas. Speeches about honor, country, and duty echoed through the auditorium. Richard watched it all with a mix of nostalgia and melancholy. He remembered his own graduation 20 years earlier, when he had dreamed of a brilliant and honorable military career. Just as the official ceremony seemed to be winding down, General Anderson approached the microphone again. "Officers, families, and distinguished guests," he said in a grave voice, "before we conclude today's ceremony, I must address a matter of utmost importance to our institution." The auditorium fell silent. Richard felt his heart race, unsure what to expect. Several weeks ago, an officer in this region was publicly accused of desertion during the flood rescue operations in March. These accusations not only shook the officer and his family, but our entire military community. Karen gripped Richard's hand tightly. Emily stared at the general, her eyes brimming with tears. "However," the general continued, "a thorough investigation has uncovered facts that completely change our understanding of the events of that tragic night." General Anderson paused dramatically, looking directly at Richard. "Major Richard Thompson, I request that you come to the stage immediately." Richard stood on shaky legs. The entire auditorium turned to watch as he made his way to the stage. Murmurs of curiosity rippled through the crowd. When Richard reached the stage, General Anderson stood beside him facing the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," the general said firmly, "we have discovered that Major Richard Thompson not only did not desert during the rescue operation, but carried out one of the most extraordinary acts of heroism I have witnessed in my career." The auditorium was utterly silent. Richard could feel his pulse throbbing in his temples. "Major Richard saved 47 lives the night of the flood," the general continued. 47 human lives were spared thanks to his courage, dedication, and disregard for his own safety. Gasps of surprise and admiration spread through the audience. Karen wept openly, while Emily beamed with pride. "More than that," General Anderson went on, "we found that the accusations against Major Richard were fabricated by a corrupt officer who tried to cover up his own cowardice by stealing another's credit." The general paused and looked toward where Reynolds was seated. The colonel had gone pale and was trying to hide among the other officers. "Therefore, in the name of justice and military honor," the general said, turning back to Richard, "I not only withdraw all charges against you, but also announce your immediate promotion to the rank of colonel in recognition of your extraordinary acts of bravery." The auditorium erupted in applause. Richard couldn't believe what he was hearing. 20 years of service, followed by weeks of humiliation, and now he was being promoted in the most honorable way possible. General Anderson took the new colonel insignias and personally placed them on Richard's shoulders. "Colonel Richard Thompson," he said loudly enough for the entire auditorium to hear, "it's an honor to serve alongside a soldier of your integrity." But the ceremony wasn't over yet. General Anderson gave a signal, and a line of people began approaching the stage. They were the 47 people Richard had saved on the night of the flood. One by one, they came to embrace him and thank him. Mrs. Eleanor Sullivan, 80 years old, was the first. "My colonel," she said with tears in her eyes, "you gave me a second chance at life." The entire Miller family came up on stage. The children, who had grown since March, ran to hug Richard. "Uncle Colonel," little Ethan shouted. "Mom said you're our hero." Old Howard Gardner, who had been the first to testify in Richard's defense, walked slowly toward him. "Colonel, I told you I'd help prove your innocence." "Mission accomplished," he said, giving a respectful salute. Mrs. Jennifer Miller approached with a letter in her hands. "Colonel Richard, we wrote you a letter. All 47 families signed it. We want you to know we'll never forget what you did for us." Karen, Emily, and Mrs. Margaret came on stage to join Richard. The family was together again, not just physically, but in spirit. General Anderson took the microphone one last time. "There's something else everyone should know about Colonel Richard," he said. "Among the people he saved that night was my own grandson, Justin, who was visiting his grandparents in Lakewood." The auditorium fell silent, waiting for the conclusion. "My grandson was trapped in a collapsing house. If not for Colonel Richard's courage, I would have lost not just a beloved grandson, but also the chance to watch one of the most special children I know grow up." A 16-year-old boy stood up from the audience and walked toward the stage. It was Justin, the general's grandson. "Colonel Richard," the young man said. "I didn't remember who had saved me because I was so scared, but when my grandfather showed me photos from the accusation ceremony, I recognized you immediately." Justin hugged Richard tightly. "Thank you for giving me the chance to grow up and have a family," he whispered. General Anderson was visibly moved. "Colonel Richard, you didn't just save my grandson. You saved the joy of our entire family. For that, beyond the promotion, I'm awarding you the Medal of Honor, the highest decoration our region can bestow." The general placed the medal on Richard's chest as the audience gave a standing ovation for several minutes. Mrs. Margaret, who had come on stage, took the microphone with the general's permission. "I want to publicly apologize to my son-in-law," she said, her voice breaking. "I judged you without knowing the truth. Richard, you're not just a hero to these 47 families. You're a hero to ours too." Emily couldn't hold back and ran to hug her father. "Dad, I always knew you were innocent. Never doubted it for a second." Karen approached her husband and kissed him in front of everyone. "Richard, you're not just my husband, you're my hero," she said. General Anderson had one final surprise. "Colonel Richard, beyond these honors, I'm pleased to inform you that you're being transferred to command the new Special Operations Base being built here in Lakewood. It will be a position of great responsibility and prestige." Richard finally spoke, his voice choked with emotion. "General, officers, families present," he said, "I only did my duty as a soldier and as a human being. Any one of you would have done the same." "No, Colonel," General Anderson replied. "Not everyone would have the courage to enter collapsing houses, carry people for miles through the mud, or risk their own lives 47 times in a single night." The general turned to the audience. "And now, to conclude this ceremony appropriately, I'd like you all to meet the true coward of this story." He signaled to the military security stationed near the exit. "Colonel Michael Reynolds, step forward," the general ordered. Reynolds tried to hide but was escorted to the front of the auditorium by security. His uniform no longer bore the insignia of a colonel. "Former Colonel Reynolds," General Anderson said sternly, "you are under arrest for falsifying military documents, abuse of authority, witness intimidation, and wrongful appropriation of merits." The auditorium watched in silence as Reynolds was escorted out. His attempt to destroy Richard had backfired on him. "Let this be a lesson to us all," General Anderson concluded. "The truth always prevails, and military honor can never be tainted by personal ambition." The ceremony ended with the entire auditorium giving a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Richard, now Colonel Richard, was surrounded by his family, the people he had saved, and his fellow soldiers who finally knew the truth. Betty, the head nurse at the hospital, approached Richard as the crowd began to disperse. "Colonel, that night I saw many heroes, but none like you. 47 people owe their lives to you. It's a number I'll never forget." Richard hugged the nurse gratefully. "Betty, if it weren't for you keeping all those records, I never could have proven the truth." "It was God who guided everything, Colonel. The truth always finds a way to come out." Emily approached her father with tears of joy. "Dad, now the whole school will know my father is a real hero." "Emily, what matters most is that our family is together again," Richard replied. Karen, who had stayed strong throughout the ordeal, finally allowed herself to cry with relief. "Richard, my heart was literally broken. Now I can breathe again." "Karen, none of this would have been possible without your strength and your faith in me." General Anderson approached the family. "Colonel Richard, I hope you understand why secrecy was necessary during the investigation. We needed irrefutable evidence before acting. General, I understand completely. and I'm grateful for the fair way you handled everything. Starting Monday, you'll assume your new post. It will be challenging, but I'm confident you're up to the task." Richard saluted the general. "It will be an honor to serve under your command, General." Margaret approached her son-in-law humbly. "Richard, I hope one day you can fully forgive me." "Margaret, there's nothing to forgive. You're part of our family, and families overcome any hardship." The elderly woman hugged Richard with tears in her eyes. "I'll spend the rest of my life proud to have a son-in-law like you." When the family finally arrived home that night, they found a surprise. Neighbors and friends had decorated the house with banners and congratulatory signs. The same community that had avoided them for weeks now welcomed them as heroes. Mr. Smith, the neighbor Richard had saved, stood in front of the house with a bouquet of flowers. "Colonel Richard, the whole neighborhood wants to apologize. We were unfair to your family. Mr. Smith, you were deceived just like everyone else. What matters is that we know the truth now." The impromptu party lasted late into the night. People Richard had saved kept showing up to thank and congratulate him. Each story was a reminder of the impact one person could have on so many lives. The next day, Richard woke up with a strange feeling. For weeks, he'd carried the weight of injustice on his shoulders. Now he felt light, renewed, ready to start over. Karen was doing much better. Her heart problems had completely stabilized after the case was resolved. Her cardiologist confirmed that stress had been the main risk factor and that she could now return to a normal life. Emily went back to school as a hero. The same classmates who had humiliated her now treated her with respect and admiration. She used the experience to grow and become an advocate for those suffering injustices. "Dad," she said over breakfast, "I want to study law so I can help people like us. No one should go through what we did." "Sweetheart, I know you'll be an excellent lawyer," Richard replied proudly. Attorney Charles Bennett came to visit the family to congratulate them on the outcome. "Richard, this was one of the most rewarding cases of my career. Seeing justice prevail like this is rare." "Charles, without your help, we never would have been able to organize all the evidence," Richard said gratefully. "The truth was there. It just needed to be presented the right way." On Monday, Richard officially took on his new role as commander of the Special Operations Base. His first act was to gather all his subordinates to establish the principles that would guide their work. "Gentlemen," he said, "this base will be built on 3 pillars: honesty, courage, and justice. I won't tolerate any behavior that harms a single member of this team." The news of Richard's promotion and Michael Reynolds' arrest spread throughout the military region. Other officers who had been wronged by Reynolds over the years began speaking out, sparking a larger investigation into his career. Major William Cooper, who had led the covert investigation, was promoted to lieutenant colonel for his outstanding work. He became one of Richard's key advisors at the new base. Private Brian Wilson, who had found the courage to turn over the recordings, was promoted to sergeant and transferred to a better position closer to his family. The 47 families Richard had saved organized an annual celebration in his honor, which became a tradition in Lakewood. Every March 15th, the anniversary of the flood, they gathered to give thanks and remember the importance of courageous people in times of crisis. General Robert Anderson visited Richard at his new base a few months later. "Colonel, I've been following your work. The base is running smoothly and your leadership has been exemplary." "General, I've learned that true leadership means serving those under your command," Richard replied. "Exactly. And speaking of which, there are rumors your next promotion might come sooner than usual." Richard smiled. "General, I'm happy where I am. Serving with honor matters more than any promotion." "That's exactly the attitude that makes you the kind of officer our institution needs." Karen returned to her work at the hospital with renewed energy. Her experience of nearly losing her husband to injustice made her even more dedicated to helping patients and families in difficult times. Margaret became one of Richard's biggest advocates in the community. She used her influence to share the true story and make sure everyone knew about her son-in-law's heroism. The Richard Thompson case became a model studied in military academies for the importance of integrity and thorough investigation before making accusations. It also became a case study on how unchecked ambition can destroy careers and harm the innocent. Reynolds was tried and convicted of all military crimes. He lost his pension, all the honors he had received throughout his career, and was expelled from the armed forces. His attempt to destroy Richard resulted in his own downfall. 2 years after the memorable graduation, Richard was promoted to general, becoming the youngest officer to achieve that rank in the region. His first order as general was to create a witness protection program within the armed forces, ensuring no subordinate would fear speaking the truth. During his inauguration ceremony as general, he gave an emotional speech about the importance of truth and justice. "I've learned that the truth may take time to come out, but it always does," he said. "And I've learned that the support of family and community can overcome any injustice." Karen, Emily, and Margaret sat in the front row, applauding with tears of pride. The 47 families were also present, along with Betty, Dr. Charles Brian Wilson, and everyone who had helped in the search for truth. General Anderson, now the region's supreme commander, personally presented Richard with his general's insignia. "General Thompson, your journey is proof that honor and integrity always prevail over corruption and lies." The former major, once publicly humiliated, was now a general, respected by all and recognized as one of the region's finest military leaders. His story became a legend, inspiring generations of young officers. Emily, already in law school, wrote her thesis on her father's case, analyzing the legal importance of evidence and witness protection. The paper was so well received that it was published in a national law journal. During a visit to the old base where he had been humiliated, now as a general, Richard met some soldiers who had witnessed his disgrace. "General," a young soldier said, "I was at the ceremony 2 years ago when you were accused. I couldn't understand how anyone could call a hero a coward." "Soldier, that experience taught me that truth is stronger than any lie, but we must fight for it," Richard replied. "General, you're an example to all of us." Richard regularly visited the families he had saved. It was a way to keep the memory of that terrible night alive, but also to celebrate how life had rebuilt itself for all of them. Little Ethan Miller, now 5 years old, always ran to hug Richard during his visits. "Uncle General," he'd shout, "Mum says you're an angel who came to save us." "Ethan, I'm just a soldier who did his job," Richard always replied. "But Mum says not all soldiers are as brave as you." Margaret, now 82, remained strong and independent. During one visit, she shared a thought that stayed with Richard. "General, do you know what the real miracle of that night was?" she asked. "What was it, Margaret?" "It wasn't just that you saved us. It was that you proved there are still good people in this world. That gave us all hope." Karen turned 50 the year Richard became general. At her birthday celebration, she gave a heartfelt speech. "2 years ago, I thought I'd lost everything, my husband, my family, my health. Now I know I've gained so much more. I have a hero for a husband, a brave daughter, a mother-in-law who loves me, and a community that stands by us." The party was a reunion of everyone who had been part of Richard's journey. The rescued families were present, along with military colleagues, neighbors, Mrs. Betty, Dr. Charles Bennett, and even young Justin, grandson of General Anderson. Justin, now 18 and about to enter military academy, approached Richard. "General Thompson, I want you to know I chose a military career inspired by you. I want to be the kind of officer who saves lives, not one who puts them at risk." "Justin, I'm certain you'll be an excellent officer. And remember, true heroism isn't about seeking glory but serving others." During his speech of gratitude, Richard reflected on the entire journey. "Friends, 2 years ago I thought my career was over, that my family was destroyed, that injustice had won. Today I know all of this made us stronger. Adversity revealed who our true friends were, showed the strength of our family, and proved that the truth always finds a way." He looked at Karen, who smiled with tears in her eyes. "My wife nearly lost her health defending my honor. My daughter faced humiliation at school to prove my innocence. My mother-in-law used all her influence to support me once she realized the truth. They are the real heroines of this story." Emily stood up to speak. "Dad, during the worst moments you never lost your dignity, never grew bitter, never gave up fighting for the truth. That taught me more about character than any book or class ever could." Mrs. Margaret, now 72, also wanted to speak. "Richard, I made the mistake of judging you without knowing the facts. But you taught me that forgiveness and reconciliation are possible. Our family is more united now than ever." The evening ended with everyone singing the national anthem, not out of military duty, but out of gratitude for living in a country where justice, even if delayed, is still possible. In the following years, Richard continued rising through the military ranks, always holding to the principles that had guided him from the start. He became nationally known as an example of integrity and courage. He never forgot the lessons learned during the hardest days of his life. With every important decision, he remembered the suffering injustice could cause and the importance of always seeking the truth. The story of General Richard Thompson became an inspiring legend told in military academies, schools, and communities across the country. It was proof that a single act of courage could not only save lives, but transform them forever. Emily graduated with top honors in law and opened a practice specializing in defending victims of injustice. Her first case involved a soldier falsely accused of desertion, a situation that reminded her so much of her father's story. Karen became the hospital's social services coordinator, creating programs to help families in crisis. Her personal experience made her even more effective in understanding and supporting those facing hardships. Mrs. Margaret dedicated herself to community volunteer work, always sharing her son-in-law's story as an example of perseverance and integrity. She became a beloved and respected figure to all. 10 years after the flood that changed their lives, the Thompson family organized a special ceremony. Richard, now a major general, unveiled a memorial honoring the flood victims and the heroes who took part in the rescue. On the memorial, a plaque bore the names of the 47 people Richard had saved that night. Each name represented a life, a family, a future, preserved because of one man's courage. During the dedication ceremony, Richard gave his final public speech about that terrible, transformative night. "This memorial isn't just about a natural tragedy or a man who did his duty," he said. "It's proof that the truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds a way to prevail. It's a testament to how a united community can overcome any hardship. And it's the certainty that every act of courage, no matter how small, can change the world." All 47 families were present, many with children born after the flood who grew up hearing the story of how Uncle General had saved their parents. Mrs. Eleanor Sullivan, now 92 and still sharp, was invited to unveil the memorial plaque. "General Richard," she said in a steady voice, 10 years ago, you saved me from a collapsing house. Today you've saved our memory, making sure this story of courage and hope is never forgotten." The memorial became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking inspiration in tough times. Visitors from across the country came to learn about the general who was unjustly humiliated and became a symbol of resilience and integrity. End of story. So, what did you think of this story of perseverance and justice? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever faced an unfair situation in life. Do you believe Richard made the right decisions throughout this ordeal? Share your honest thoughts below. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to like the video and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories like this one.